Hi, I'm Art Fein. This is Art Fein's Poker Party, coming to you from Hollywood, really from Hollywood this time, with a really extraordinarily specialist guest I ever had. We got Mr. Steve Allen. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Art. Nice to be here.
It's nice of you to be here. Nice to have you here.
Nice to be had.
And on my left, not quite so special, but nice to see you too.
Thank you for that warm introduction.
Come on, Mark, you've been on.
I've been on
15 or 20 shows. I like Mark Leviton a lot, and when I told him I had Steve Allen on the show, he flipped and said he dropped everything.
I did.
The same thing happened when they told Flipper this morning about that. Came right up out of the water.
In preparation for this show, I got this book, Steve Allen's brand new book, Hi Ho Steverino, which is quite an interesting tome. It's your 38th book and your first autobio, right? I mean,
no. My actual autobiography was written when I had done very little living back in the 1950s, about 1957. It was called Mark It and Strike It, which is a technical term of television. This is autobiographical, but it concerns only my 50 years in radio and television.
Well, boy, I mean, this is the one we've all been waiting for. It's really an amazing...
I didn't realize that, or I would have written it sooner. I hate to keep people waiting. To see people walking up and down the sidewalk in front of their houses. Hey, is Alan's book out yet? I got to get dinner, for God's sake. Sorry I delayed everything.
It's got so much stuff from the early days of TV and stuff. And
yeah, well, I did a lot of stuff. I'm a stuff specialist.
And actually, I had first encountered your serious side, which is certainly showed in this book, as a youngster when I picked up not an August publication or a July publication like Nation or anything. It was in The Best of Grump, which...
My goodness. I have no conscious recollection of that. May I examine the evidence, Your Honor?
Well, you wrote a thing there, believe it or not,
Apparently.
about people talking out loud in theaters.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Which we were just discussing.
And
side by side with Isaac Asimov. I have all his albums.
And this was, of course, nobody knows about this. This is a publication put out by Roger Price prior to Price, Stern, and Sloan. I've got quite a few copies, and I would say there's collector's items, but I don't think anybody collects them except me. So they're a wonderful humor magazine. And I read this thing by you about how people tend to talk out loud in movie theaters. This is 1966, and of course the situation's improved quite a bit since then. A lot of people read your book, and
yes, if you dig deterioration, things are much better now.
Well, jump right in.
Of course, everybody has a different way of dealing with people talking in theaters. I can remember on an awful day, I was having a terrible day, and some kids were talking behind me in the movie theater, and I turned around and I said, "If you don't shut up, I'll shut you up." And I felt I still feel guilty now, 20 years later, for having done it.
I actually did something like that once. I confessed this years ago in my autobiography, so it's not something for the Globe or the Inquirer right now. But I have flipped out maybe only twice in my life. Once when I was 9 years old and I lost my temper and hit another kid. Maybe only twice. The other time was in a theater around 79th Street, I think, in New York City. I was under this is a true story, I was under considerable emotional stress at the time. Some difficult scenes were happening in my life. And I was overtired, and I attended a showing of what was even then an old film. I think it was called If I Had a Million. It had several stars in it, and it was a series of short stories or one-player forms, scotch taped together and made into a movie. And there was one that was very touching. It showed a group of about 8 old women in a poorhouse or an old folks' home, whatever they used to call them then. And a great actress, whose name escapes me at the moment, was reading, supposedly to entertain the other women there, a letter from her son. And as she did, it was a sweet, warm letter. "Dear Mom, we sure miss you," and all that stuff. And as she read this letter, the camera came around. It was a very modern sort of camera technique, and moved in, and you realized that it wasn't a letter from her son. It was an ad from a laundry. She was making this up to cheer up her fellow inmates. Very touching. I mean, the proper response to the scene was a tear or two, And now I must backtrack to explain that for about an hour before this, there were a group of rowdy teenagers yelling and ruining everybody's afternoon at this theater. And I tried a couple of shh, and they would stop for about 10 seconds, and then really raunchy, vulgar language, and there were children present. It was a disgusting situation. So finally, one of the old women stepped up and began to approach the camera, and she had palsy or something. She was dragging one foot, and her poor old hands were shaking. She looked truly pathetic. And one of these monster kids yelled, "Shake it, baby." And when that happened, I flipped out. The only time I've ever done it as an adult. The next thing I know, I heard a man screaming. I guess on cable we can use such language because I'm not trying to shock anybody. Shut your goddamn mouth, or I'll shut it for you, or some such words. And to my surprise, the man on his feet screaming was me. I got a tremendous ovation from the audience because they were all intimidated by these teenage bullies with the leather jackets and all that. There's more to the story, but I won't bore you with it now. But what you do occasionally, have to be extreme in your reactions to.
I think that people now, well, first of all, live theater is probably not something that most young people ever go to. They go to a rock concert, but that's not quite the same because the music is so loud you can do anything you want.
Sure, you can talk all night. Yeah.
But kids do react to movie screens as if they're having some interaction with it, as if they're in the room with the people.
Yeah.
And it's pretty annoying.
Sure is.
Yeah.
So we just taught a story, the moral of which is shh.
That's right.
Well, have you seen the ads in the theaters for that?
Yes, it's gotten that bad that they now have to encourage, gentlemanly or anyway, civilized behavior.
Yeah. Well, I'm digging this book to death. I'm not here to promote it, but I am promoting it. By the way, a very nice review mentioned Rick Dubrow last week in the LA Times.
Yes,
all about,
very, very kind reference indeed. Yeah.
Very nice. And going back to, of course, where I first knew about you was, it's the Steve Allen show on opposite Ed Sullivan. And all things being equal, in my household it was strictly Steve Allen. And then in the book you remind me that Maverick was on at the same time too. It was a hell of a thing.
In the third year, Maverick came on and knocked both Ed Sullivan and myself.
Oh, they did?
They shot right up near number one. There was one night, I think, when Ed's rating and mine together wasn't as big as Maverick's. Oh. So NBC and I agreed that would lift me up out of that competition and move me to, I think, Monday night.
And that's probably when I lost you.
Could be, if you were a Sunday night freak.
There's all this reference to a syndicated Westinghouse show in the 60s, which, Lord knows, I was not that small of a tyke. I would have made some effort to stay up. I'm wondering whether it ran in Chicago where I was.
You were in Chicago? Yes, it did.
It did.
I don't know what time. It could have been.
Yeah.
If syndicated shows, they run any time
I
they
see.
want.
The time to run it is optional. I thought it was on at 10:30 opposite Carson, as you mentioned in here.
In many cities it was,
Right.
but not in all.
Yeah, it might have been in the daytime when I was in school or something. The stunts, the kind of anarchy that you represented on the show is, we can still see it now on the reruns or the packages you put together that runs on the Comedy Channel.
Well, you actually can't see the anarchistic talk shows. What you're seeing, and I'm very pleased that you are, is another program, had the same title, Steve Allen Show, but it was the Sunday night primetime feature, the one that was opposite Sullivan, as you were saying. And that featured our great gang, Louis Nye, Don Knotts, Tom Poston, Bill Dana, Pat Harrington, Gabe Dell, Dayton Allen, eventually Tim Conway and the Smothers Brothers. I think the best comedy group of all time in television.
Well, you're talking about relative anarchism, whether or not you're saying that the Sunday night show wasn't as anarchistic as the next stuff, but in fact...
Well, it wasn't as loose and free form as the talk shows. I think it was the second best comedy show of its day. I would put the Sid Caesar programs, whether they were called Show of Shows or Howdy Your Sister, whatever they were called. To me, that was always the Sid Caesar show. Yeah. I think he is the equivalent in television of Chaplin in movies, the greatest television comedian of that type. Nobody's the decathlon champ of comedy because most of us just do 2 or 3 forms. Most of us, in fact, do 1 form. But in this kind of sketches he did, I would rate him number 1, and our show number 2.
Well, what I was saying, though, was that the Comedy Channel, which some of us get, does run your show late at night, the half-hour synopses of the Sunday night show. And it's such a thrill because that stuff's been buried and none of us could see it all these years.
And it looks great. A lot of people in your age bracket have told me that it even seems funnier now than they remembered it being in the old days.
Wasn't it difficult to keep the material around? I know a lot of old shows have been erased and thrown out.
Well, there was always the risk that they would get lost. My whole 4 years of The Tonight Show, I should explain to 12-year-olds watching, I created The Tonight Show and was the first host of it. That entire 4 years has been wiped out with the exception of maybe about 30 shows which were just preserved at random. So there is that risk, as I say. But fortunately, we do have, I think, all but 1 or 2 of the 4-year series that we're talking about.
Were you conscious at the time of doing the shows that I might want to keep this someday, or?
Never entered our minds. In fact, we're lucky to have copies at all because this was pre-videotape. Most of it was anyway, and there wasn't much that was taped. But the only reason we have it is that the networks, at least, made what they call kinescope films of just about everything they telecast, purely for legal reasons. Just as in radio days they used to make audio recordings, particularly on any shows that were a little bit loose, because otherwise somebody could sue them and say you said so-and-so, and if they had no proof that they didn't
Right.
say it, they could be at risk. So we had these legally backed videotapes. I don't mean tapes, I mean kinescope films. And thank God we had our own copies in addition to the network's copies, so that's what people are now watching on the Comedy Central channel.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Because I could still, what little is being released by you on that format, though, like you say, you got even wilder later. Just the looseness, the sense you don't know what's going to happen next, even though it's scripted.
Yeah.
It was just so exciting, and
Well, it was live, which
Yeah.
is part of the reason for the excitement. And then we all did work loose. We were a very happy family, professionally and personally. All of the guys in that gang were still personal friends. I didn't think anything was unusual about that at the time, and there's a sense in which it isn't. But to make a comparison with Saturday Night Live, a very funny show most of the time, I've learned simply by reading a book about it that over the history of that program there have been a lot of enmities and cliques and resentments and rivalries, which is a pity. It's so much more fun if you get along with people.
Mm-hmm. You also had sort of the ability to be performing and be standing back, sort of watching yourself performing at the same time, and then every so often you'd sort of comment on the fact that you were watching yourself. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I don't think of you in terms of like Kovacs as far as using tilting cameras or things like that.
Yeah, he did a lot of great visual tricks.
He did more of that, but I always felt that you were just, the invitation that you gave to the audience was sort of watch how this happens. Watch how I'm going to do this.
That was sort of a partly conscious approach. I am apparently the only comic, what I'm about to say is neither praise nor blame. It's just like saying I'm the only one that wears green underwear. I'm the only one who always insisted on working off a monitor, which means simply I had a TV set. The reason was that it had nothing to do with ego. Most of the time other people were on camera. I wanted to know what the people at home were seeing right then. And in fact, I've often wondered why all the other comics didn't do that, except maybe they would end up staring at themselves and that would look dumb. I often did not look, but if I was, for example, if I called for a point, I'd say, look at the funny way this leather is. It appears to be an actual snake, but it's probably... I wanted an immediate close-up of that, and the only way I could tell whether I had it was to look at the TV screen. Mm-hmm. So I assisted the directors, shall we say, in calling for certain shots.
So then you could react quicker and you could play off of that.
And it didn't take long on one of the talk shows, particularly the Westinghouse show of the 60s, to condition the cameramen who were sharp as tacks. Generally, they anticipated the director. If I picked up this book, they would have a close-up before I even got my hand still, you know. So that did help.
it's a lot like that at public access. I want to change horses now into a different vein. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a mixed metaphor, I guess.
Horses have
different
veins.
stream. All right. This is often a music show, and rock and roll is my beat. And now let's talk about you and the two main guys that you had an influence.
I should explain to young people, I love rock. I don't care for roll that much, but I'm a big rock fan.
In Elvis discussion groups, a lot like your Meeting of the Minds show, your name comes up with duality.
Yes.
There's the guy who put Elvis on, probably, the third or fifth or 16th TV show appearance, but maybe the biggest one, the big breakthrough.
Yeah.
Because it was in July '56 that you had him on, and if we were real sharp, we would have caught him earlier on the Dorsey shows or a couple of Milton broadcasts. Right. But it was your impact, the impact of being on your show, that really propelled him forward, which then immediately he went to Ed Sullivan. But still, as you know, your legacy is kind of dual because you're kind of blamed for harnessing him on that show.
Yeah, and also a lot of people think that I despise rock, period, and never saw any good in rock at all, which is simply not the case. Yeah, I can understand that. I think the true blue Elvis fans never wanted anything different than just Elvis. Of course, that didn't work out when he got to movies, because he had to pretend to be a surfer or a cowboy or a disc jockey or something. So movies always distort the reality of an actor, usually much to his improvement. But in the case of Elvis's appearance on our show, we did a comedy show. He actually made more sense later on the Sullivan Show, which is why I gave him my permission to go over to Ed. The Colonel came to us that night because everything had gone so well. And he explained that he had a few minutes earlier gotten a call from Ed, it was a pretty gutsy call, calling him at our theater, but he got him backstage. And he was so panicky that I had booked him first. He was a journalist, I must explain to young people. So he was looking for scoops and beats and priorities.
Oh, Ed Sullivan was. Okay,
Ed Sullivan
gotcha.
was,
I didn't
yeah.
think Colonel Tom Parker was. Yeah.
And anyway, Sullivan said to Colonel Parker, I'm calling to offer you a firm deal for 5 or 6 appearances with $10,000 per guest shot. Now today that sounds like pocket money, compared to what rock stars make. Hell, Oprah Winfrey makes $30 million a year. But in the 1950s, it was a big pile of bills. And it had never been earned by anybody on television before. The top then was $7,500, no matter what superstar you were. That's all you got. That's all any big star got. So Ed was breaking the sound barrier out of his panic. And so Parker said, I'll get back to you. He came over to us, and 2 minutes later, and he told us about this conversation. And he said something like, don't quote me. He said, but we've had so much fun here tonight. He said, you can have Elvis as long as you want him, but it would have to be at the same price because I can't pass up money. But if you'll give me the money, it's a deal. So we got back to him about 2 minutes later, and our producer said to me, what about it? I said, well, I made Elvis funny tonight, but I don't want to have to do that every week because he's not funny himself. I love him, but he's not funny. And so let him go to Ed, and we'll book Clark Gable or somebody. Yeah. So that's how that did happen.
Back to the Elvis fanatics and their little dolls they're putting pins in of you. Mm-hmm. So they said that you restrained him. Now in your book, which I don't mind showing again, your book
called Hi-Ho Steve Reno.
You talk about the fact that you didn't restrain him. You put him in a tux, and it was his movements, which I want to show a little of right now. We have about a 1 minute clip of I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, followed by Hound Dog, and we can talk about that afterwards. Let's take a look at that, okay?
That's okay. Elvis, now what you going to sing? What are you going to sing for us first tonight?
I want you, I need you, I love you.
Here's the big RCA hit.
Hold me close, hold me tight, make me thrill tonight. Let me know where I stand from the start. I want you, I need you, I love you with all my heart. When I said you was high class, well, that was just a line. Yeah, they said you was high class, well, that was just a line. Yeah, you ain't never gonna rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
Okay. I too have felt a little bit like when I look at Elvis in that tux, which he's not maybe comfortable in, that perhaps this was like a straitjacket for the guy. But then watching the I Want You, I Need You, I Love You clip, he looks okay with it.
Yeah, he did everything he did if he was wearing underwear.
And the Hound Dog thing, I mean, he's chuckling. Mm-hmm. And then later on, maybe we'll show a little of it, is the Barnyard skit with Andy Griffith and Imogen Coca. And you named him Panhandle Presley or something like that.
Right.
And I've heard that too referred to as like some great humiliation doing a hillbilly skit with him because he's from the South or something like that. And no, I mean he looks like he's having fun.
Oh yeah, no, those criticisms they only came from about 12 people in the first place, and they're dumb. No, there's some criticism you should listen to and respond to, at considerable length, but not that. Elvis had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I thought he seemed to have. And I've seen lots of still photos from that period. Mm-hmm. Also in the book, though, you do say that you don't think he's such a hot singer, which is.
No, I didn't say that. I said he doesn't have a good voice because nobody ever said he did. So it's not an arguable point. Did you think he had a good sound?
Well, there's like 500 million records sold, and most of those people didn't see him. I mean, probably it's something about the sound of his voice that people did like.
Something about. Actually, it was Elvis's personal charisma. The reason I booked him, I'd never heard of him before I saw him this particular night on the Dorsey Brothers summer show, and I recognized right away that he, as they say, had something. Mm-hmm. It certainly wasn't a good sound, if I may try to steamroller you on this point. Again, you may think that a nail rasp is a good sound or a buzzsaw is a good sound, so we'd have to agree about the discussion as to what a good sound means. There is the operatic tradition. We all would agree that the great singers of opera, Pavarotti, whatever, that is a beautiful sound. Andy Williams has a beautiful sound. Frank Sinatra, as a younger man, had a beautiful sound. Even if you didn't understand, if they were singing in Polish, you would say that is a pretty sound that comes out of that man or woman's mouth. Peggy Lee, Dinah Shore, Ella Fitzgerald. No one ever said that except today yourself about Elvis's sound. This sound didn't mean a damn. It was him and all those people who bought his records, I assure you, had seen his 8x10s and his TV appearances and the magazine articles about him. It was chiefly his face that accounted for his stardom. There are about maybe a dozen factors that did. It was the fact that he sang like a black man. He was one of the first white men to sing like black people. He also had a little sprinkling of country on him, too, in his singing style. But he just had a cuteness and a likability, a boyishness, a cute sex appeal. I think if I were a 14-year-old girl, I would have found him very sexy. And, of course, those 14-year-old girls are now 60 or whatever the age would be, and they still dig him. But a beautiful sound he really never had.
Well, wouldn't you say that the sound, I mean, whether somebody's a good singer has to do with the appropriateness of their instrument for the type of thing they're doing?
If he had sung like Pavarotti, he never would have made it. You're absolutely right. Louis Armstrong was one of my favorite singers, and doesn't have a sound at all. It was just kind of a, you know.
Right.
So you don't have to have a good sound. There are many good singers tonight working in lounges who have beautiful sounds, but that's all they have, and they'll never make it. So I was just taking one aspect of Elvis and commenting on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, on that same tack, as long as this is your little Nuremberg here, let me also say that as you're sometimes known as an enemy of rock by a bunch of petulant people who have sneers like Elvis, there's the business of reading the rock lyrics slowly, like Bebop-A-Lula.
Yeah.
I talked to somebody yesterday, a seemingly reasonable, rational guy in his late 40s, who says, "Are you going to talk to him about that goddamn reading of the slug?" I'm still mad about that. 35 years later, Bebop-A-Lula. Yes, she's my baby. And of course, we all knew, we the receptors to that music, knew that the lyrics weren't the point.
Yeah,
but,
you're absolutely right.
And maybe we were a little thin-skinned, perhaps, about senses of humor.
If I may resolve your dilemma very quickly, I'll explain that I was doing that routine long before America's kids knew anything about rock. The only people in America who knew about rock originally were black people. It was called rhythm and blues then, and they occasionally used the word rock. As a matter of fact, everybody thinks was it Bill Haley that's credited with Rock Around the Clock? I heard that song 20 years earlier, sung by a black woman in a nightclub near Chicago. So it must have been sort of an underground black hit. And it all comes out of the black culture, in which it was totally authentic, and in which I loved it, by the way. But I forget what my chief point was.
Reading lyrics.
Oh, you're reading the lyrics. The first time I ever did that was 1948. There wasn't a white kid in America who had ever heard the word rock at that point. I just used popular songs. I didn't care whether they were rock, schlock, or sideways. The first song I ever did in that way, which had a truly inane lyric, was a giant hit. It was about number 4 on the hit parade, called Love Somebody. This is the lyric. Love somebody, yes I do. Love somebody, yes I do. Love somebody, yes I do. Love somebody, but I can't say who. Love somebody, yep, I do. It was just, I mean, you're laughing now, not at my talent, but at the inanity of that lyric. So it was kind of a little silly experiment that night. But because it got screams, I realized, hey, I've stumbled over a good bit. I can keep changing the songs for the next 50 years, so it'll never go out of style. So to this day, I do that in most of my comedy concerts. It never has bombed. I change the merchandise every so often. The last 2 or 3 years I've been doing chiefly the Rolling Stones classic, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which if you read it sounds like it was written by either a 4-year-old or the biggest dummy in town. You know? But the melody and the arrangement were swinging.
Okay, well that's gonna. I think it'll settle a lot of people's.
And if rock ever goes out, I'll continue doing the bit with whatever replaces it. You know.
I want to put in another video clip right now, a kinescope clip actually.
All right.
This is another wild man you introduced, of course, Mr. Jerry Lee Lewis. We're putting the end of Great Balls of Fire twice. I'm going to the last 30 seconds of the song twice.
All right.
And because it features the furniture flying, and,
yes.
and I want to talk about that afterwards. And also, please, when you see this, if you haven't ever seen this, at least the first clip, it's the last part of a whole lot of shaking going on. And if not the most exciting, and it's a very exciting moment, it's the most excited person I've ever seen. Jerry Lee is out of his mind.
Oh, yeah.
First time on television ever out of Tennessee.
Yeah, he was flying.
Let's take a look at these two back-to-back clips.
All you gotta do, honey, kind of stand in one spot, jump around just a little bit. That's when you have flat got something, you know. Now let's go. Shake! Shake! Honey, shake! Shake, baby! Shake, baby! Shake! Big bacon! Whole lot of shake! Go,
That was funny. We repeated that. I don't mean we, I was just along for the ride. They repeated it when they made the motion picture of his life called Great Balls of Fire.
Yeah.
Great Balls of something. And when he did that on my show, he kicked his piano bench out, and just to be funny, I watched the monitor, as I explained earlier, and then when they were on a wide shot, I threw the chair through, and then people from the other side were throwing stuff back. So they asked me to play myself in the movie and do that same shtick.
Yeah, I saw it, and I'm also not the only person that thinks Elvis sings good, but I'm the only person that likes that movie.
I like it too. There's two of us.
Oh yeah. Okay. It wasn't, I guess, a very good picture according to the reviews.
And the furniture flying, I guess probably he had to bring another two guys along on the road now to throw chairs back and forth after you.
Funny. Yeah, he had a great, obviously, great excitement. And he was also kind enough to name his son after me.
I'm aware of that. So what about the contact with him? You had seen Elvis on the Dorsey Brothers show, but here's this complete nut. I mean, this complete. Did you, from hearing the record, a whole lot of shaking going on, and knowing there's a phenomenon going on, you couldn't have had any inkling of quite how crazed he was when you.
You're right. I didn't know exactly. I wasn't at that point. I wasn't all that familiar with him. I became familiar from his appearances on my show, and then other attention he was paid by the public then. But yeah, I've booked a long list of rock acts over the years, and of course, rock does not mean one thing. There are 74 different kinds of rock. We had the Supremes on before the world had ever heard of them, and a lot of good people.
Bob Dylan, a lot of people. Matter of fact, we're going to go out on this, on a non-rock showing of Frank Zappa, who was on your show in 1963, on your show in 1963, playing the bicycle. So
yes.
I want to thank you very much for coming down.
Thank you, Art.
Real good time.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you guys.
Mark, thank you. Let's take a look at just any part of that Zappa clip and go out of it and run the credits over it with sound, of course. The young fellow, he was from Cucamonga at that time, I believe.
Was he?
Blues, or exactly what are you going to lay on us here? I'll just let you show us what happens.
The first thing that I should do is demonstrate to you the different types of sounds that you can get from a bicycle, because it actually does make some very interesting sounds, and of course that's what we're all interested in.
There's new sounds, yes. Like buck, buck, buck.
That's one of the sounds that you can get.
Yes. Oh, you have a microphone down there, I see.
Well, I'll need this microphone to pick up the next sound. It's you have to hold it right there.
All right.
Hold it right here.
Hold it right here. I'm sorry, you'll have to leave a message. He's not here right now. That's pretty good. Oh, there's a...